Oh, by the way, reviewing the assignment 2, I should have all the rest of assignment 2 graded by the end of today. Really good stuff. I know I've graded about 5 of them so far, so as small as our class is, that's almost half of you, so maybe a little bit less than half. So, but really impressive things, so I was really proud to see how far I know a lot of people have gotten. So I have looked at all of them, and I got to say that it's nice. Every semester they seem to get a little better and better and better and better, so good to see. I don't think anybody will be shocked to receive a poor grade. I think everyone did a good job. All right, so Illustrator, let's go ahead and open up our prompt. So if we go over to Canvas and you click on Getting Started with Illustrator, you're going to notice that it says Using the Font Design Template. All right, so you guys are going to click on that to download the Illustrator file for the font design template. I already have that, so I am going to double click on it. Of course, what do we got here? Oh, never mind. I guess it still works out fine. And that will open up this the font creation file. So what this file is used for, we've actually had this assignment now for a few years. For those of you that maybe have seen this in the past, we've actually changed it up a little bit because the old font website that we actually used went out of business, and I actually figured it out in the middle of the tutorial last semester when I went to go and type it in and show you guys how to turn it into an actual font, and it was no longer there. So this is another website that does the exact same thing. So we're going to be using this this tutorial here to create our own font. Okay, so we'll talk about exactly how to do that here in just a little bit. To start out with Illustrator, let's go over the Illustrator interface a little bit. You'll notice that it corresponds very closely to InDesign, into Photoshop. You'll notice a lot of the same tools, a lot of the same functions. All the layout is very much the same. So you're going to notice that you have your contextual ribbon up here in the top, just like InDesign, just like Photoshop. You're going to have your vertical ribbon both on the left-hand side, both on the right-hand side as well. You'll notice, just like InDesign, when we have up here into this little package of presets menu, you're going to have the same thing in Illustrator. Okay, so did I click record? I did. So just like InDesign, if you click up here, we're going to be working on essentials most of the time. But as we move on to other things like typography, we're not going to be really looking at printing and proofing or tracing or web, but we'll go back and forth between the different prompts, okay? As you learned in InDesign, if you click on the different ones, you'll get a variety of different tool sets and toolbars over here on the right-hand side. So depending on what you like to do with the software, you'll figure out which one works best for you. Myself, I use Essentials a majority of the time. That works out just fine. So just like our other programs, you'll notice that we have a ribbon, or I'm sorry, not a ribbon, our rulers on both the left and on the top. If you right click on them, you can change their format to whatever units that you'd like. Unlike InDesign, it already has it on inches, so you don't have to change it from picas to inches, okay? So as it comes up when you open the file, it will be ready to rock and roll. So as we move over to the left-hand side, as we move over to our different toolbars, you're going to notice a lot of the similarities between our previous commands. A lot of you use the pen tool in InDesign when you're creating frames, okay? The only difference is we didn't really get into the depths of really how powerful the pen tool is. I don't personally use it a ton in InDesign. I use it for making frames, and that's really about it. But you'll use it a lot more in InDesign, and especially for architectural diagramming, which we will get into sometime next week, okay? But let's see, what else do we got here? So you probably recognize a lot of these tools. You have the Eyedropper Tool, which you guys have seen. You'll notice a similar palette in terms of color with both Photoshop and InDesign. You'll notice that we have our fill color and our stroke color. So remember that stroke represents the outer boundary of a shape or of a letter, okay? So if you guys are typing something or you're creating a variety of different shapes, the stroke always represents the outer boundary, and whereas the fill represents, just as it says, the fill, okay? So the nice thing about Illustrator is that you have a lot more tools to be creative and to do some stenciling, to do some painting, to do a lot of more graphic art than you do with InDesign. InDesign is focused on the layout of objects created by both Photoshop and Illustrator. And we're going to have a little short lecture next class about the differences between raster and or between raster images and vector images. Okay, so more about that to come. All right, I don't want to get into too much detail because I know I'll just end up giving the whole lecture if I start talking about it right now. So you should be familiar with a lot of these tools. A lot of them should look familiar. You have your regular selection tool, you have your direct selection tool. We'll look at a lot of those today, along with our pen tool. We're also going to look at the width tool today. We're also going to look at the line tool. We'll look at the text tool, and I'm sure we're not really going to take that back. We're not going to look at too much about the text tool and the rectangle tool. Being that you know how to use them pretty well from InDesign, they'll work exactly the same way with Illustrator. So not too many changes there. Something to keep in mind, just like our previous programs, is that if you see any of these tools with the little drop-down arrow at the bottom right-hand corner, that just means that you have, if you click and hold, that you have additional tools to use. Okay, so don't forget about all the extra tools that are kind of hidden behind the primary ones. All right, and as you select on these different tools, you'll notice, just like our previous software, our contextual ribbon continues to change to give you more tools that are associated with the primary tool. Okay, so let's go ahead and dive right into the pen tool. So as I stated earlier, we're going to be making our own font today. The use of the pen tool is honestly not really related to creating fonts at all, but it's a really good exercise in terms of just practicing using the tool. You're going to encounter a variety of different scenarios when you're creating your fonts that will focus around about 3 or 4 of the different tools that we're going to use today. We'll also look at the stroke tool. We'll also look at layers as well. Layers works just like InDesign, okay? Not like Photoshop in that you have a layer for every single object that you place on your screen. All right, it works a lot more just like a lot like InDesign. You'll notice, like InDesign, we have a guides layer, and these layers have already been created for you. They're all a part of this myscript.com template that we've been given. Okay, so the guides have already been given to you. You'll see that, you can see them in blue right here on the screen. Those guides are used to reflect. Remember when we did the lecture, when we talked about typography, and we had the baseline, we had the variety of different lines that we use to work with our lowercase and our uppercase letters. That's what these guides are given to you, so that you have kind of an understanding and a top and a bottom to all of the letters that you work with today. So, but something to keep in mind as you guys start to trace these different letters is that you don't need to try to duplicate or replicate exactly what you have on the screen. Okay, have some fun with it. Create whatever letters you want. So if you want a specific look, you get a whole wide range of things every semester, from people that literally try to trace it exactly as you see it. Sometimes I see really fun and creative characters. Sometimes I see kind of old Roman text. So feel free to make it however you want. I'm sure you'll probably just kind of stumble upon something as you start to create the letters. But just remember that the main focus is not so much about creating the perfect font. It's practicing the pen tool. So it's an important tool. We'll practice it today. We'll practice it on Wednesday as well. Both are pretty fun exercises, and once you are able to create your own font, it's kind of a cool thing to see created. So our goal today is to complete the first half of this tutorial. So if I go down to something a little bit smaller, you'll notice that we have our regular characters up here on the top, and we also have our optional characters. Okay. I don't need you to create all of them, all right? In fact, if you absolutely fly through the top, 50 or so, Actually, I guess it's more than that. It's actually like 70. So I know it seems like a lot, but you'll fly through a lot of them, I promise. If you fly through all of them, there's always a couple people that finish all of them in like an hour. So if you're one of those people and you want to move on to the optional characters, great. If not, the main focus I would say would be to at least get to 0. Okay. So that would be great if you at least got to 0. But if you finish quickly, keep going, do as much as you can. Obviously, the more you do when you actually upload it into the software, the more you'll have that correspond to your keyboard. So if you don't do the $, when you get the $, you're not going to have a character that corresponds to that. So your goal should be at least to get up to the 0. Okay? Any questions about that? Good? Okay, so let's go ahead and look at the pen tool. So we're going to go over here, we're going to click on the pen tool. I'm just going to go ahead and jump right into creating our first letter. I'll probably do the first row for you, and I'll probably do maybe a couple of the more complicated characters like D. Surprisingly, O, P, S is a tough one. Okay. So if we go over down here to our layers, you'll notice that the layers are already organized in a fashion that you don't really need to do much. You have your font layer. You're going to want to make sure that when you are creating your font, when you're using the pen tool, that you have the font layer selected. Okay, so everything that you draw on your screen is going to be under the font layer. The base layer is going to be what you see on your screen right when you open it up. Currently it's locked, all right? It's locked for a reason so that you don't accidentally select it and move it around, and next thing you know, it's nothing's working correctly. Same thing for the guides. The guides are already locked into place, so you don't have to worry about them moving around as well. Okay, the guides are also on a no print layer, just like InDesign, I believe. Let's see. It's been a while since I've done this one. I believe you should be able to do the exact same thing. I'll come back to this in terms of previewing how it's going to print, okay? We'll come back to that though in just a second. So we have our guides layer, we have our base layer, and we have our font layer. We're gonna go ahead and select font, all right? We're gonna select font, we're gonna go ahead and select the pen tool. Notice that when you hold down on the pen tool that you have a variety of different tools. You have the add anchor point tool. We also have the delete anchor point tool. Those will be some that we focus on a little bit today, but mostly the pen tool, probably like 90% of the time, okay? So we're gonna select pen, and we're gonna go down here and we're gonna alter some of our colors. We're actually gonna wanna make sure that our fill is not white, but instead of white, we're gonna click on none, okay? Because we don't want any fill. We wanna be able to draw as if we have an actual pen, and it's not gonna fill it up as if it's a shape, okay? I'm going to go ahead and change that back to white, and I'm going to change it to red just to kind of show you what that does. So if I start to click on my pen tool, notice that the boundary, I'm holding down Alt and using my wheel to scroll just like Photoshop and InDesign, okay? But notice that my stroke is black, just like you see down here on these two colors, and the fill is red, okay? So if I continue to click using my pen tool, it will continue to fill up that space with that color. So just like you were creating a frame in InDesign. So I know I've seen a few people kind of create some unique frame shape. It works exactly the same way, but we're going to start to get into some more complex shapes using the tool in InDesign. Okay, so I'm going to delete that, and then if we go ahead and click on the fill and we click on none, you'll notice that now when I start to draw, I don't have any fill, but I now have more of just line work. Okay, so that's what we're going to focus on today, is working on just the line work. All right, so I'm going to Control Z, let's backtrack, and let's start to create some of our first characters. Any questions about that at all? Great question. I would say for now, leave it at 1. We're going to go ahead and create maybe the first 5 characters, and then we're going to go over and we're going to explore the actual stroke tool, and we'll look at all the different components to that tool. We'll look at how to kind of start to customize the different characters. We'll look at how to edit the line work. We'll look at how to create a variety of profiles, etc., etc. So more to come on that here in just a second. But let's go ahead and start on A. A is a pretty easy one. In fact, you'll realize that most of the characters with just straight orthogonal line work are all pretty easy. Where it gets pretty complicated is when you get into shapes like B, S, D, things with curved edges. But I remember when I was creating my portfolio and I was working on my thesis project, I used Illustrator all the time to do architectural diagram. Things like really intricate arrows, going through my spaces. And you have to have really curved segments. Well, it actually gets pretty tricky, as I'm sure I'm going to see lots of frustrated faces here once you guys start. It's okay. We all go through it. So let's go ahead and jump right into A. So I'll zoom in nice and close. And remember that the bottom line here represents our baseline, okay? And our top line, or our top grid line that we see here, so the blue line, not so much the gray line. The gray line is actually the line that was a part of the template. I would pay more attention to the blue grid lines that we've created here, okay? So baseline represented by the bottom line. The top of the cap line for capital letters is going to be the top line. The top of our lowercase letters will be the line just below that, okay? So we're going to go ahead and start with our capital letters, and let's go ahead and start drawing the first one. So I am going to click one time to create our first point, okay? And to create our lines, we're going to continue to select the various points of our letter, okay? So here I'm creating an A. I'm going to go ahead and go to the top of my cap line, and I'm going to create the next point of my A, and then I'm going to come down and create the bottom point of my A, okay? Pretty simple stuff, all right? It's not too complicated, but we'll continue to move forward on this. So the next part of creating this letter is going to be to create the line that crosses our two diagonals. So I'm going to go ahead and hit escape. I'm going to hit escape twice. Actually, I take that back. Don't hit escape twice. You're going to go ahead and click on the selection tool after that. The shortcut for the three tools that we're going to use most today, selection tool is V. The direct selection tool is A, okay? It takes a little practice. I'm actually not going to use them because I want you guys to see me clicking on them as I go through the process. And then P for the pen tool, okay? So instead of going over here and clicking, you could also click on A, and that would bring you to, V, and that would take you to your selection tool, okay? Whenever you want to transition between a couple different shapes that you're creating, so when we break down the A into a couple just of our basic forms and basic shapes, it's broken down to the V, and it's also broken down to the line that's going to connect the two, okay? So if I try to go up and create this point up here, and actually let me just kind of show you what would have happened. All right, if I go over and I go 1, 2, 3, and I try to go up to the top here, you could do that and you could go over across, but it's not going to start to connect the tools properly. Okay, I prefer to actually hit V. Okay, V will deselect it, and then I'm going to use my pen tool again. So I'm going to click on the pen tool, and I'm going to go ahead and click one time. I'm going to hold down Shift. Shift will ensure that my line is straight. Okay, just like when you're using InDesign and Photoshop as well. And I'm going to go ahead and cross that A. Okay, I'm going to let the line intersect both of those two characters, okay, for the purposes so that I could show you the next tool. You don't necessarily have to, unless that's what you want your font to look like. So feel free to use your own creativity. If you want to have some intersecting lines and you have your lines doing some crazy things, that's completely up to you. Okay, so the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to move the points to attach and align with my original shape that I created. Okay, so I'm going to go over and click on the direct selection tool. The difference between the regular selection tool and our direct selection tool is that our regular selection tool will select the shapes as a whole. So I notice that when I select the crossbar here, it selects the entire line. If I select the V, it selects the entire V, okay? Now I would select the direct selection tool to do something a little bit different, and that's going to be to manipulate the individual points that we have drawn, okay? So I'm going to go over and click on that point that we just created. I'm going to click on it, and I'm going to hold down Shift, and I'm going to move it over so that it snaps over to our original V that we created, okay? So I'm gonna go ahead and grab this one, I'm gonna move it over, it's gonna snap to that, okay? So that's gonna be our first shape, okay, or our first letter, that's gonna be the A. So before we move on to a more complex shape, let's look at some different options that we can perform to start to customize our letter just a little bit. Okay, so I'm going to go over and I'm going to click on the stroke tool over here in our right hand vertical toolbar. So I'm going to click on stroke, and you're going to notice that we only have one option, and that's going to be the line weight. So if I click on my regular selection tool, or I'm going to hit V, and I click on my line, I can then click on the up arrow or the down arrow or the little drop down menu to select from a variety of different line weights. You can also just simply punch in whatever you want. If you want 0.5 or 0.75, you can get as precise as you'd like, okay? But more importantly than just selecting the weight, you can go over to this little right hand drop down menu, and we're gonna click on this little icon over here on the right, okay? And it's gonna say show options, okay? We're gonna click on show options, and we're gonna get about 20 more tools that we can utilize in the stroke menu, okay? You're gonna have that show options menu for a majority of the tools that you see over here on the right hand side. Why that's not really a part of just the initial time you click on it, I don't really know, because most of the tools that I always need are actually in the show options menu. But if you click on that little show options menu, you can also click on hide options. You'll get all of the variety of different stroke tools that we want to use, okay? So right now, I have the V selected. Okay, we already talked about weight, but let's move down to where it says cap, okay? The first cap option is a butt cap. We also have a round cap, and we also have a projecting cap. So I'm gonna click on round cap, and notice that over here at the bottom, it's a really tiny little change, but notice that it rounded off the corners of our letter, okay? This is a really minuscule change, but remember when we talked about a while back ago, but it's all the little kind of tiny details that overall, when you're all done, you know, give the really nice effect to the overall font, okay? You could pay no attention to any of these little extras, but ultimately if you're gonna create a really nice font, you're going to, you know, you're gonna pay attention to the finer details of the font, okay? So that's one option. The cap will change how the first and the last point of your line look, okay? So we started off with a butt cap, which is just the line ends up with 90-degree edges at the end. So we also have the rounded cap, and we also have the projecting cap. Very minuscule difference between our first one and our projecting. You'll just notice that the projecting just goes a little bit further beyond where we originally clicked, okay? I'm gonna go ahead and just leave it on the middle one, round cap. All right, the next option is corner, okay? The corner represents where we have our bends, okay? So this point right here, all right? So right where we have the base of the V. So just like the cap tool, I can click on the round join. Notice that it rounds the corner over here. So it starts to make it just a little bit more elegant of a turn, okay? Where this might become more apparent is when, let's say you have your pen tool and you do something like this. Well, if you don't quite want such harsh corners, you can start to finagle some of those bends. It's very subtle, but it will make a difference when you get to things like architectural diagramming, etc. Okay? So even though this won't relate to what we're doing for the font exercise, we also have something called the dashed line tool. Okay? So if I click on dash line, it will turn that line that we just created into a dashed line. And the nice thing about it is that you have the option to control how the dash look. So right now it's a 12-point dash, so it's a fairly large dash, but I could change this to something like 2, okay? And notice that we have much smaller dashes. So you have the ability to make that line look however you want. So that's the beauty of the pen tools. We're gonna get into refining the really fine details of line work, okay? That's the main focus of using the line tool. So we have the dash line tool, so we typed in 2-point. I can also control how or the width of the gap in between the dashes. So I might do 2 dash 2 dash 2. Notice that that changes a little bit. Maybe we have a really big gap. Maybe that's something like 10. Okay, that starts to look a little funky. It'll become more apparent as you guys actually start to do line work. It'll become a lot more apparent next or on Wednesday when we move on to our next exercise for the pen tool. I'm going to turn that off for now. All right, and we'll even look a little bit more about arrowheads next class. We're going to talk about profile here in just a second. All right, so let's move on to some of our other characters. Okay, let's move on to B. All right, this is where it's going to start to get a little bit more complicated. So I'm going to go back and select on my pen tool. I'm going to go ahead and make my base line. Notice that when your pen hovers over our grid lines, you'll notice that in green, you can barely see it, that it says guide. That's telling you that you're snapping to the guide that you initially created. Okay, so I'm going to click on that point. I'm going to hold down shift. I'm going to do a nice maybe straight line for this one. Okay, and then the next part is going to be the more complicated part, and that's going to be to create the curve of the B. Okay, so I'm going to hold down shift. I'm going to create the next segment of my B, and then I'm going to come down and I'm going to pick the point, or I'm going to pick the tangent point of that arc, which is going to be right where that arc meets its largest point. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and click on that point, and I'm going to hold down, and notice that as I'm holding down my mouse, I can start to define the tangent of that arc. Okay, so I can make it kind of as natural or as obscene as I really want it to. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and make sure that the nice thing about it is that it gives you a nice little preview. Okay, and another thing that will also help you is if you hold down shift, it will help you create a more subtle bend in your pen or in your line. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and release my mouse. Okay, and that will create that first part of the B, and then I'm going to go down and I'm going to select just one time. I'm actually just going to click right there, and that's going to duplicate that first part of the arc that I just created. Okay, and then from there I'm going to hold down shift, and I'm going to finish the first part of the B by connecting it to our original line. Okay, all right, still kind of easy, not too bad. All right, so I'm going to hit I'm going to hit V, and I'm going to deselect from that, and I'm going to then create the next portion of our letter, which is going to be the bottom here. All right, so I'm going to go back to my pen tool. I'm going to hit P, and then notice that when I go down here to the bottom, that we have a little tiny icon just to the bottom right of our pen tool. All right, what I'm actually looking for when I select my next point is I'm actually looking for this little kind of diagonal line here in the corner. What that's telling me is that when I have that little diagonal line, it's actually going to continue off of the original line that we had created. Okay, so instead of creating multiple line segments, it's going to continue to create one continuous line segment from our original line. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and click right there as my first point of my new shape, and I'm going to come out a little bit. I'm holding down shift. All right, it then continues off of our original line, and I'm going to make the next portion of my B. All right, I'm holding down my mouse right now, and I'm going to go ahead and adjust my my tangent accordingly. All right, and then I'm going to go and I'm going to click just below this point right here. The reason that I'm pretty positive you were to actually click on that point that it wouldn't actually connect it. I like to always click just off just a little bit. Okay, so I'm going to click right there. All right, and notice that it made kind of a funky shape. You're going to encounter that all the time with the pen tool. The important part is to realize how to easily fix it, and we can easily do that. Okay, so from here I'm going to click on my direct selection tool. Okay, so that's going to be, the shortcut will be A for that. And I'm going to go over and I'm going to click on that point, and I'm going to move it and connect it to the vertex of where we ended the first part of our B. Okay, and that starts to look pretty good. Okay, some of you guys may encounter some kind of funky looking shapes. If you guys ever do that, remember that you can always click on a point. So I'm going to click on the vertex of, not vertex, apex. That's the term I'm looking for. The apex of that curve. I'm going to click on that point, and then notice that right on top of that point, above and below, that we have two little handles. Okay, so I can grab either of those handles and I can start to manipulate that curve. Okay, so if you ever realize that it's not quite right or it's getting a little wacky, you can start to grab those little handles and manipulate your curve accordingly. Okay, so you can always get really detailed in terms of what your shapes start to look like. Okay, so that looks pretty good. It's starting to look a little bit more natural. Okay, so that's going to be my B. All right, any questions about that so far? All right, good. So next, let's go down to the C. So the C will be the first good test of using that pen tool. You could just go just like this, and you can start to finagle this so that you get the different curves. Okay, but you're going to notice that as you do that, it starts to look a little. It starts to look like a little lumpy. It starts to look a little crooked. It's not really the most smooth and elegant line. Okay, so you can fix that by using your direct selection tool, and you can start to move some of those lines, and you can adjust some of your tangents. Okay, and you can probably get it looking pretty good. Okay, but there's a couple other ways that we can actually go about doing this, I think, better. And something to keep in mind is when you're doing curves, always try to have the least amount of tangents as possible. Okay, if you can get away with doing like 2, in this case, let's try doing this actually with 2. Okay, I'm going to do 1, or maybe like 3. Okay, that looks a lot better because I have a lot less tangents. Okay, but if I go back and I do something like this, it starts to look really crazy and crooked, and it looks ugly. Okay, so always try to have the least amount as tangents for the most fluid curve that you can create. But let's look at another way that how we might create this shape. Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to use some shapes that we already have. Okay, that we can already utilize to create the more elegant curve of things like the C, the D, the O, etc. So I'm going to go ahead and use the Ellipse Tool, and I'm going to start up here, and I'm going to try to mimic that C in the best way possible. So notice that the top and the bottom of my letter go to the baseline and the cap line. Okay, so that looks good. All right, so that's going to be the base, kind of the basis of the C letter. Okay, and then from here, I'm going to go over and I'm going to click on my pen tool, and I'm going to now click on the Add Anchor Point tool. Okay, I am going to add an anchor point to where I feel the top or the first point and the last point of my C should be. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and click right here. That's going to be my first point, and I'm going to go down, I'm going to click on the bottom, and that's going to be my second point. So that's going to be the top of my C and then the bottom of the C. And then from there, I can go over and click on my direct selection tool. I'm going to click on the middle of those 2 points. So notice that this was point 1 right here, point 1 and point 2, and right in the middle we have our midpoint of those two, of that line. So I'm going to click on that midpoint, and I'm going to hit the delete button. Okay, and that's going to delete that segment of that line. Okay, and notice that's a much fluid, much nicer curve than we originally had. So the point of that is be aware that you have some tools over here that will create a lot of these shapes, partially for you. Okay, and that works really well for the C. Okay, you can probably do the same thing for the D. Okay, I'm going to go over, I'm going to use that ellipse. I'm going to do something about like that. I don't even need to add any anchor points. Okay, I can actually just use my direct selection tool. I'm going to click on that midpoint. I'm going to hit delete, and then from there I'm going to go and turn on my regular pen tool. Okay, regular pen tool, and I'm going to go over to that first point. Remember that I'm looking for that little kind of diagonal little line below that to know that I'm going to connect to my original line. And then from there I can click. I'm going to hold down Shift go down, and start to connect to that. Okay? That looks a little funky. You can move that up a little bit. All right? And that starts to fix that. So there's my D. And then from there, obviously, some of these will be really, really easy. I'm just going to start going through some of them pretty quickly. Okay, maybe this one's a little slanted. Let's see, maybe we come down here. Okay, so there's my E. If I wanted to copy that over, I can press Control C, bring it over to my F, Control V, line that up, just like so. And I'm going to use my direct selection tool. I'm going to get rid of that baseline. Actually, take that back. I'm going to go over to my pen tool. I'm going to click on Delete Anchor Point, and I'm going to click on that point right there. The reason why I didn't click on the middle is because we didn't have a middle anchor point. So if I use my Delete Anchor Point tool, I can get rid of that entire segment. So there we have our G. Okay, I'm gonna let's just do 2 more letters before we move on to a couple of our other tools. So I'll go ahead and do the G. Again, I'm gonna use my Ellipse tool. This starts to work pretty well. I'll use my Ellipse tool, and let's define what a couple of those different points are. So I'm gonna select maybe there and there. Okay, direct selection tool, boom, get rid of that. And let's use our pen tool. I'm going to go ahead and click right there, come back up. Okay, there's our G. Okay, so you can see that it's starting to get pretty quick. The first couple might be kind of slow, but eventually you're going to be doing a letter every 30 seconds. Okay, so it'll get pretty easy. Now let's go down to one that's probably going to be the most complicated. Maybe we do the letter S. The letter S will probably take a few different tries, okay? Even to this day, probably every time I try to do it, it always turns out a little weird, but let's go ahead and go through it. All right, so I'm gonna start maybe here on this line. That's gonna be the bottom of the end of our S. I'm gonna make my apex of the top bend right up here like so, okay? So I'm holding down my mouse, okay? Remember that I'm holding down my mouse to create that initial bend, all right? If I hold down Shift, that'll give you a nice kind of even point there, all right? I'm gonna click one more time to, for the most part, replicate my original line that I just created, okay? And then I'm gonna go through and try to continue to replicate some of those curves. Okay, it looks kind of funky. No big deal. I can go over and click on my direct selection tool. If I need to add additional points, like right here, I probably need an additional point to smooth that out a little bit. So I'm going to go to my Add Anchor Point tool. Let's add one right there. Okay, and now I can go to my direct selection tool, and I can start to kind of smooth that out just a little bit. Okay, you can see how that's starting to get a little bit better. You guys can probably, you might be able to use some of the shapes that we've used. You might be able to use the oval. So use your imagination, okay? I'm just gonna leave it like that for now, okay? I'll show you some more tools a little bit later and how we can start to refine that. All right, so let's continue to move on. So that's gonna be kind of the basics of our pen tool, all right? So that teaches you the pen tool, the Add Anchor Point tool, and then also the Delete Anchor Point tool. All right. We've also learned a few little bits and pieces about the different stroke tools that we have. Okay. So the next tool that we're going to learn about is going to be the width tool. All right. So that's going to be this one right here that kind of looks like a clown hat. Okay. It's directly above the Shape Builder tool. So it's this guy right here. All right, so the width tool. Shortcut is Shift W. So we're gonna click on that width tool, okay? I'm gonna zoom into our A, and what it does is it allows us to select any line that we have created. In this case, I'm gonna go ahead and use my A, okay? And notice that as I move my cursor over that line, it'll automatically kind of snap to the line that we've already created, okay? And if I select any particular point, so I'm gonna go ahead and select right here, notice that it starts to widen the line that we've created, okay? And that will do that at the whatever point that you select. Okay, so maybe you want to start to fine-tune your lettering a little bit. Maybe you want to start to customize your font so that it's not so basic. You can start to use things like the width tool. Okay, so that might be something that you use as you move forward with customizing your font a little bit. Okay, so just a couple different options. Okay, so that's going to be your width tool. All right. The last tool that I want to look at is I want to look at the profile tool. So if you click on stroke, all right, so if you click on stroke, we're going to look at the profile tool. So what that's going to do, and the C is actually a really good example of using the profile tool. So that's going to allow us to apply a profile to a piece of line work. Okay, so if I click on the drop-down menu, let's look at the effect that this has on our line. So the first one, notice that this first profile starts really, really skinny and to a point, gets really fat in the middle, and then gets really skinny at the end of the line. So this point that you see right here on the profile is always going to be a representation of our first point where we first created that line, and this is always going to represent the end of the line. So if I click on that profile, notice that we now have a really skinny or a really sharp point at the beginning. It gets fatter in the middle, and then it gets really skinny at the very end. Okay, so that's going to be that particular profile. Okay, and then you guys can go ahead and experiment with some of the others. This one's a little bit different in that it goes from a point, and it gets fat, and then it goes skinny, and then fat, and then skinny, and it starts to kind of get a little wavy in terms of how that line starts to look. Okay, so that's going to be your profile tool. So experiment with some of those to get some different kind of shapes and undulations with the line work that you're creating. Okay, so with that said, is there anything else that I want to, I feel like there's one more thing. I'll probably think of it next class. Any questions at all?
Tell us what you're going to tell us, and then you tell us what you told us. So, stroke tool, width tool, profile tool, what else?
I think that's it. Did I skip a tool? I'm going back in my memory of whether or not I skipped a tool. I don't think so. We've talked about the pen tool, add anchor point tool, delete anchor point tool. We've also talked about the selection tool, the direct selection tool. We've also talked about the various different shapes. Okay. We've also talked about the width tool, and we've talked about stroke and layers. Okay, I think that's about it. We're going to talk more about the pen tool and some of the other pieces next class when we continue. Next class we're going to be working on the pen tool, but we're going to actually create some kind of line artwork. So it'll become a little bit more fun, and you'll actually get a nice kind of graphic as the end result versus just letters. Okay, but let's go ahead and call it quits for there. That'll be plenty for creating your own font. Okay, so again, your goal should be to get through. I'd love to see at least to the end of 0 today. All right, we have lots of time. We have about almost 2 hours left in class. Okay, so try to get to 0. If you guys can finish 0 quickly, go down to the very bottom and finish the original fonts. And then next class, the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to learn how to upload this into the program, and we'll actually generate our font. Okay, and I'll show you guys how to upload that into Illustrator, InDesign, Word, whatever you want. Okay, questions at all? All right, you can also use this time to finish up your assignment 3. That's due by the start of the next class. If you don't have that done yet, work on assignment 3. All right, keep going.